You said it's a really interesting challenge today, a deep dive into the heart of Kenyan politics and specifically impeachment processes. We've got articles, legal documents, even some firsthand accounts. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, the sheer number of governors facing impeachment attempts is a good place to start. Since 2013, we're talking 11 governors and 3 deputy governors.
Wow.
That's a lot. Makes you wonder if this is really about accountability or if something else is going on.
Yeah, it does feel like there's more to this story than just the numbers. And speaking of numbers, you mentioned 11 attempts, but when we look at actual removals, only 2 governors, Mike Sonko from Nairobi and Ferdinand Watitu from Kiambu, were actually removed. Isn't a pretty stark difference, isn't it?
It is, and it hints at the complexity of the system. It's not as simple as just accusing someone and getting them removed. There's a lot of steps, a lot of players involved. It's like a political chess match with very high stakes.
Okay, so let's break down this chess match. You actually sent over some information on Article 181 of the Kenyan Constitution, which seems to be the rule book for all of this when it comes to impeaching governors. What's the gist of this article?
So Article 181 lays out the grounds for impeachment, things like violating the Constitution, abusing their power, or serious misconduct. But the real meat of it is the process itself. There are 3 main players: the county assemblies, the Senate, and ultimately the courts.
3 players. That does sound like a complicated dance. I'm guessing most of our listeners, myself included, might not even know what a county assembly is. Can you give us a quick breakdown of how this whole thing actually works in practice?
Absolutely. Think of county assemblies as the local governing bodies at the county level. They're like mini parliaments for each county. If a member of a county assembly wants to start the impeachment process against a governor, they need at least 1/3 of their fellow assembly members to back them up. If they get that initial support and the motion passes with a 2/3 majority, then the case moves on to the Senate.
So it's not a solo mission. It needs serious support right from the get-go. So the county assembly is like the first hurdle, and if the governor trips there, that's when it goes to the big leagues, the Senate.
Exactly. The Senate then receives the impeachment motion from the county assembly, and they have the option of forming a special committee of up to 11 senators. This committee acts as a kind of investigative team, spending 14 days going through all the evidence, interviewing witnesses, really getting to the bottom of things. Their job is to figure out if the allegations against the governor hold water or not.
Okay, so they're like the investigators,
Huh.
gathering all the facts and presenting their findings.
Yeah.
But the Senate doesn't have the final say, do they? I mean, this can still go to court, right?
You're right. The Senate's decision isn't the be-all and end-all. The governor can appeal the Senate's decision to the high court, and they have to do it quickly, within 14 days. The court then holds a hearing and has to make a decision within 30 days. It's like a safeguard to make sure things are being done fairly.
That's interesting. It seems like the system is set up with checks and balances in place. No single body holds all the power. But hearing all these steps, I'm curious how this actually plays out in a real-world situation.
Well, we actually have a perfect example of this. The case of William Odual, the deputy governor of Siaya.
Oh, right. You included his story in the materials you sent. He faced a pretty public impeachment attempt recently, didn't he?
He did, and his experience provides a really good illustration of just how intricate and potentially perilous this process can be, even if the impeachment attempt ultimately fails.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. So walk us through what happened with Odual.
Sure.
What can his experience tell us about the Kenyan impeachment process in action?
So in Odual's case, the Senate Special Committee actually recommended that he be impeached. They felt the evidence against him was strong enough. But here's where it gets really interesting. The full Senate actually voted against the committee's recommendation, and Odual survived the impeachment attempt.
Wow, that's a pretty dramatic turn of events. It sounds like even with a recommendation for removal, the Senate can still go in a different direction. What factors do you think influenced that decision?
One thing that stood out was that the Senate vote seemed to largely split along party lines.
Hmm.
This suggests that political allegiances may have played a significant role in the outcome, highlighting how political dynamics can influence these proceedings.
So even though there's this whole legal framework, there's also a layer of political maneuvering happening behind the scenes. It makes you wonder if the process itself is vulnerable to political influence. And what about the personal cost for someone like Odual? Even though he survived the impeachment, I imagine going through something like that must take a toll.
Absolutely. You've hit on a critical point. Even when an impeachment attempt fails, the process itself can be grueling. It's very public, very damaging to one's reputation and career, regardless of the outcome. This raises some important questions about the potential impact on governance, particularly when you consider the sheer number of impeachment attempts we've seen.
It does make you wonder, if governors are constantly worried about being impeached, even if those attempts are often politically motivated, how does that impact their ability to govern effectively? Do they become more cautious, less willing to make tough decisions for fear of backlash?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a concern that a lot of people in Kenya are voicing. Some people argue that the current system is too easy to manipulate for political gain, which can lead to instability and hinder effective governance.
And speaking of those concerns, you actually included some powerful quotes from individuals who've experienced this firsthand, former Governor Sanko and Governor Oparanya. What kind of light do their experiences shed on this issue?
Their perspectives are really insightful and in many ways quite revealing. Former Governor Sanko has been very vocal since his removal, stating that his impeachment was purely a political move orchestrated by former President Kenyatta.
So he believes it was less about actual wrongdoing and more about political differences.
Exactly. He claims it was a direct result of disagreeing with Kenyatta politically and refusing to toe the line with the then ruling party.
Essentially, he believes it was a way to silence a dissenting voice, not address actual misconduct.
That's his perspective, and what's interesting is that he's not alone in feeling this way. Governor Uparanya, while never actually impeached himself, has called the impeachment process a form of blackmail, suggesting that some governors might be pressured to give in to demands from county assemblies just to avoid those charges, and a very public, very damaging process.
That's a troubling thought, this idea that the threat of impeachment could be used as leverage in political negotiations, potentially impacting how governors govern and interact with their county assemblies.
It does raise concerns about potential abuse and its impact on governance. And these concerns, especially around the possibility of political manipulation and its effect on effective leadership, are fueling calls for reform within Kenya. Some propose we make it harder to initiate an impeachment by increasing the threshold required.
So requiring more than just one-third of the county assembly to agree before an impeachment motion can even be introduced, that does seem like it could weed out some of those weaker, potentially politically motivated accusations, the ones that don't really have a strong basis in genuine wrongdoing. Are there any other reforms being considered?
Another significant proposal involves giving the people a more direct role through something called recall mechanisms.
Recall mechanisms. For our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, could you explain what those are and how they might work in the Kenyan context?
Of course. A recall mechanism essentially empowers voters to remove an elected official, like a governor, from office before their term is up. It's like a direct democracy tool, allowing citizens to hold their elected officials accountable more directly if they're dissatisfied with their performance. It adds another layer of accountability beyond the impeachment process.
So instead of going through the whole county assembly and Senate process, voters could potentially remove a governor directly. That's a pretty big shift in power dynamics.
It is. The idea behind it is to strengthen accountability while reducing the risk of the process being used simply as a political weapon. Of course, implementing something like this would require careful consideration. There are many aspects to consider. What would the grounds for a recall be? How would it be initiated? And how do we ensure it doesn't become a tool for political manipulation itself? It's a complex issue with potentially far-reaching implications for the balance of power within Kenya's government.
It definitely seems like one of those be careful what you wish for situations. It's easy to get caught up in the idea of more direct democracy, but there are always potential downsides to consider. But speaking of high-stakes political situations and the potential downsides, we can't ignore the elephant in the room any longer. We have to talk about the breaking news about Kenya's Deputy President, Rigathi Gachagua.
Yes. The timing of this conversation is almost uncanny. While we've been discussing gubernatorial impeachments, this case with DP Gachagua brings the whole issue to a national level and adds a whole new layer of complexity.
For those who haven't heard, Kenya's National Assembly just voted to impeach Deputy President Gachagua. Can you give us a quick rundown of what happened?
The National Assembly voted overwhelmingly in favor of impeachment. Out of 349 members, 281 voted yes, far exceeding the two-thirds majority needed. This is unprecedented in Kenya, at least since the 2010 Constitution. We haven't seen a removal from such a high office through this process before.
Wow, those are some significant numbers. It sounds like the National Assembly sent a very clear message. But as we've been discussing, this isn't the end of the road, is it? What happens next with DP Gachagua's case?
You're right. Just like with gubernatorial impeachments, the process doesn't end with the National Assembly's vote. The case now moves to the Senate, where DP Gachagua will essentially be put on trial.
A trial in the Senate. Does it work similarly to what you described for governors?
There are some similarities, yes, but also some important differences. Just like with the gubernatorial impeachments, the Senate can choose to form a special committee to investigate the charges against DP Gachagua. They'll delve into the evidence, hear from both sides. But here's the catch. The Senate is on a very tight deadline. They have just 10 days to reach a decision.
10 days. That's not a lot of time to consider a decision of this magnitude. Imagine the pressure. To analyze all that evidence, hear arguments, and make a decision that could reshape the country's entire political landscape, all within 10 days.
Exactly. It highlights the gravity of these proceedings. Within those 10 days, the Senate has to decide whether to uphold the impeachment, which would remove DP Gachagua from office, or to vote against it, essentially overturning the National Assembly's decision.
So all eyes are on the Senate for the next week and a half. This case has the potential to be a defining moment in Kenyan politics. But beyond the legal processes, what about the political ramifications? What does this mean for DP Gachagua's relationship with President Ruto, considering they were elected on the same ticket? How might this impact the balance of power within the Kenyan government?
You've hit on a crucial aspect of this situation. Remember, DP Gachagua and President Ruto ran together, representing the Kenya Kwanza Uday coalition. This impeachment throws their political alliance into question. Some might even call it a rift within the ruling party.
It's almost unheard of for a deputy president to be impeached while their own party holds a majority in parliament. This makes you think there's a lot more going on behind closed doors.
Absolutely. The fact that the motion passed with such overwhelming support suggests a major shift in those political alliances and loyalties within the government. It'll be fascinating to see how this plays out, both in the formal proceedings and in the broader political landscape. We're essentially watching a political thriller unfold in real time, and the ending is far from certain.
Yeah, it's like we're seeing those political fault lines crack open right before our eyes.
And it underscores a point we haven't explicitly addressed yet, the potential for external forces to influence these processes. While the Constitution lays out the legal framework, the reality is that these impeachments are inherently political. It's not always just about the charges themselves.
It's a good reminder that the law doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. Personal agendas, power struggles, even old-fashioned political maneuvering can all play a part. To truly grasp what's happening with DP Gachagua and what it might mean for the future, we have to understand that bigger picture, those political currents swirling beneath the surface.
It's definitely a situation that demands we pay attention to those nuances. But before we get too far into speculation, I think it's important to circle back to the core issue that started this whole conversation: accountability and health of Kenya's democracy.
You're right. Those are the fundamental questions, aren't they? We've gone deep into the mechanics of impeachment, both at the governor level and now with the DP. But the big question remains, is the system, as it currently operates, truly effective?
Are we seeing genuine accountability? A system that actually roots out corruption and the abuse of power? Or is it too easily twisted to serve political agendas, creating more instability and eroding the public's trust in the process?
Those are the questions a lot of Kenyans are asking right now. The sheer volume of impeachment attempts, particularly targeting governors, compared to the relatively few that actually result in removal, does raise concerns about potential for abuse. And when you add in the voices of people like former Governor Sonko, who claim their impeachments were politically motivated, it's hard to ignore the possibility that the system is being gamed.
And the DP Gachagua situation throws another log onto that fire.
Yeah.
It really brings into focus how these processes can be wielded as weapons in these high-stakes political battles, with the potential to not just remove someone from office, but to really destabilize the government and undermine faith in the whole system.
Precisely. It's a very delicate balance to strike. On the one hand, you need a system that's strong enough to hold those in power accountable, to make sure they're not abusing their positions or engaging in corrupt practices. But at the same time, you don't want a system that's so easy to manipulate that it creates this climate of fear and instability where political maneuvering overshadows genuine accountability.
It seems like finding that sweet spot, that balance between those two extremes, is the real challenge. So where do we go from here? Are there any potential solutions or reforms that could strengthen accountability while minimizing those risks? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a complex issue without any easy answers. As we've seen, there are already discussions about potential reforms. raising that initial threshold for impeachment, potentially introducing recall mechanisms, and finding ways to depoliticize the process. The real test will be in crafting and implementing these reforms in a way that directly addresses those concerns about abuse without undermining the core purpose of impeachment, which is to provide that crucial check on executive power and ensure accountability at all levels of government.
It's a conversation that requires careful thought and, perhaps most importantly, active engagement from the public. Because ultimately, a healthy democracy depends on an informed and engaged citizenry. Right.
Absolutely. Understanding how these processes work, having open and honest conversations about their strengths and weaknesses, and demanding transparency and accountability from those in power, these are all vital steps in ensuring that the impeachment process serves its intended purpose: to uphold the Constitution, protect the interests of the people, and safeguard the integrity of Kenyan democracy.
Well said. I think it's safe to say that this deep dive has left us with more to ponder than when we started. But sometimes just starting the conversation, asking those tough questions, and encouraging critical thinking about the systems that govern our lives is the most crucial step toward progress.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, and the more people understand these processes, the better equipped they'll be to hold their leaders accountable and help shape the future of their nation.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. If you could propose changes to ensure that the Kenyan impeachment process truly serves as a tool for genuine accountability and not as a political weapon, what would those changes be? Think about it, talk about it, and most importantly, make your voice heard.
Until next time, keep those critical questions coming and never stop seeking knowledge.
This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.